You can see everything. Okay. Welcome to Inspirify News, a general interest news program focusing on events shaping our world and local communities. I'm Ted Gover. Thanks for being here. Our guest today is Professor Stephen Nagy. Stephen Nagy is originally from Calgary, Canada. He is a senior associate professor at International Christian University based in Tokyo. He is also a distinguished fellow with Canada's Asia Pacific Foundation and was appointed China expert with Canada's China Research Partnership. Additionally, Professor Nagy holds fellowship positions with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and the Japan Institute for International Affairs. I strongly suggest following Professor Nagy on Twitter to keep abreast of the latest in the political and security affairs of the Asia Pacific region. He has a wonderful Twitter feed. His Twitter handle is @NagyStephen1. So that's @NagyStephen1. Professor Nagy, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Ted, for having me. It's great to be here.
Sure. Well, Stephen, if I may call you that.
Yes, sir.
Okay. You are a treasure. I mean that. I've been reading your research for years now, and I'm all the better for it as I understand the Asia Pacific so much better now. Even with all of our think tanks and university programs focusing on the Asia Pacific, and God bless them, they do a great job. Yet we still don't have enough people devoted towards explaining what's happening in the region and why it matters to voters and policymakers. We have a net deficit of those types of people and who do it well. And you serve that function in spades. And I really want to thank you for your work over your career.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. So to begin, a few questions about Japan, your home base these days.
Yep.
Mr. Yoshihide Suga has been Prime Minister of Japan since September of last year, after Japan's longest serving Prime Minister, Abe Shinzo, resigned due to ill health. Can you share with us a little bit about Prime Minister Suga, since he will face elections this autumn? Is Mr. Suga a caretaker Prime Minister in Japan, or does he have legs? And a follow-up question, what is the public's view of him and his job performance thus far with handling things like COVID, the economy, the Olympics, and whatnot?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, Ted, but I think Prime Minister Suga at this particular stage is seen by most as an inheritor of a strong legacy from Prime Minister Abe, in particular in the international domain. And what I mean by that is Prime Minister Abe fundamentally, I think, put Japan forward. It changed its global image. It became what we call a leader of multilateralism, in particular as the Trump administration stepped away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership and really had a scathing view about alliances, at least in public. So Prime Minister Suga inherited that strong performance internationally, and I think that has garnered him some credit. And I think that it's helped shape his view of how to manage his premiership. And we saw that with his first visit to abroad just in November, where he visited Indonesia and Vietnam, the two largest states in Southeast Asia, but the states I think that are most critical for Japan's signature foreign policy, which is the free and open Indo-Pacific. On the domestic front, of course, I think that the situation is a little bit different, and this is what's testing Prime Minister Suga, and will determine whether he is elected as Prime Minister in the autumn, or if he's kicked out by the party in some capacity. At this present stage, COVID-19, in particular in the Tokyo area, Osaka area, the big cities, the infection rates are increasing. And I mean, if you compare them to the United States or the UK, they're very low, right? Yeah. Maybe 1,000 a day. And that's a city of 40 million people, which is extremely densely populated. So I really would like to caveat that. I think it's important. But I think the voters here are very critical and they're concerned. And I think they feel that more could have been done in terms of preventing the infections from reaching that level. But also, I think a more effective communication and subsidy policy in terms of to support businesses that are voluntarily shutting down as Japan has entered into what's called a state of emergency in places like Tokyo and Osaka. So if the infection rates drop, which I do expect they will, with vaccinations, with the state of emergency, and with the winter season disappearing, and if the economy does rebound, I expect that Prime Minister Suga will be well positioned to hold the Olympics, importantly, and garner some political capital and be reelected as Prime Minister.
Hmm. Do you, if he were to be challenged, do you have a sense as to who some of his challengers might be?
Well, there's a few people that I think are really outstanding candidates to be a future prime minister. And one is the current minister of the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications, Kono Taro. And he previously held the positions of foreign minister and defense minister. And now he's in charge of this important role of digitizing the economy and really increasing the productivity across Japan and across the industrial sector. And I think if he is successful, he could be a potential candidate. And why I think he's attractive is that he speaks his mind. I think his broader view about security is in line with the former Prime Minister Abe, and having great concerns about China and Chinese assertive behavior within the region, as well as concerns about North Korea. He also has a long political legacy with his father being a former prime minister as well. The current foreign minister, Motegi, is also a strong candidate, but I think that he is unlikely to be a prime minister, at least in the next round. I think that he still needs to garner some more political capital. There is some talk about a woman candidate, Noda Seiko, who has garnered some attention in at least in the gossip magazines here, potentially. And I think this is interesting as a new president and vice president comes into power in the United States. The LDP is thinking about how to best position and ride the tailcoats of, I think, the Biden administration, the Harris administration moving forward, and that a potential woman candidate may be a way to accrue more votes by the average Suzuki and Tanaka in Japan for the LDP. So that's an interesting, I think, political rumor that's going around. I'm not sure how much legs it has at this particular stage. I think the male-dominated aspect of the LDP suggests that a man will be elected. But that being said, the LDP is an election-winning machine, and it chooses the best candidate to win the election. And in this, there's a possibility for a female candidate moving forward.
So here in the United States, next Wednesday, January 20, Joe Biden will be inaugurated as the next U.S. president. What are some of the hopes and expectations of Japan as Mr. Biden takes office? And what are some of the important issues facing the U.S.-Japan relationship?
Well, I think in the Japanese context, democratic governments have always been seen as weak on security and weak on China. And I think the greatest concern on the Japanese side is that the Biden administration will follow that tradition. I think that the Japanese government appreciated the Trump administration's hard line on China. They may have disagreed with some of the tactics and I think the chaotic nature of that strategy or those policies, but I think they strongly appreciated the harder line on China. So I think the Japanese government is hoping that the Biden administration will have learned from the successes of the Trump administration in terms of dealing with China, but also will take a much smarter approach, a multilateral approach, an approach that builds a coalition or an alignment of states that will put pressure on China in a very smart way. And here we're thinking about technology, here we're thinking about trade, and here we're thinking about the maritime domain. And I'll just start with technology, because I think this is an area that is the discussions in North America and Europe are a little bit different than the discussions in Japan and the region. So there's great concerns about the technological systems bifurcating or splitting into two in this part of the world. And what that means is that today the Chinese have their own digital economy. They're building a closed digital system. And that digital system is subject to Chinese law. And some of the Chinese laws were concerned, businesses are concerned about transparency, but how they fit into broader security understandings. In particular, with the adoption of the national security law in July 2020 in Hong Kong, now I think many businesses are wondering, what does that mean for their own discussions about China, and could they be subject to this law? So the national security law, cybersecurity laws, these are all concerns for Japanese businesses, which have a huge footprint in China. So I think that this is one area that the Japanese would like a more sensitive, nuanced, and smart approach to dealing with China. On the economy, like the United States, Japan shares many of the same concerns about intellectual property rights, about the role of state-owned enterprises, about environmental law, and I think Japan, it really is aligned with the United States about China opening up its market and playing by the rules and playing by international standards. And Japan has tried to engage in China this way through the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. But still, I think this is an area where Japan and the United States will work very closely together. And I think Japan strongly hopes that the Biden administration will rethink their views about the Trans-Pacific Partnership and rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership in one way or the other, because it focuses on intellectual property rights, labor law, and environmental law. And these will be key tools to shape Chinese behavior over the long term. Lastly, I mentioned the maritime environment in the Indo-Pacific. And here, this is another concern that I think Japan shares with the United States, but also many countries, is that China is rewriting the rules on the water. We have artificial islands that have been militarized in the South China Sea. The Chinese are using what we call the merchant fleet in the East China Sea to go in and out of the waters around the Senkaku Islands, which are administered and I think most understood as Japanese sovereign territory by international law. And we have a growing submarine presence and drone presence in the East China Sea, South China Sea, and the Indian Ocean. And I think these are great concerns for Japan and other trading states in terms of the freedom of access to what we call sea lanes of communication. So there's a lot on the table, and I think Japanese are really hoping that the Biden administration will be focused. And my initial reading of the Biden administration's appointments are very positive, in particular the appointment of Kurt Campbell as the director of the Indo-Pacific office in the National Security Council.
Okay. Now, Stephen, in the past, I've read your commentary about Japan's raucous relationship with South Korea. And tensions between the two countries continue, with South Korean President Moon Jae-in reneging on an agreement that his country had with Japan to provide compensation for former comfort women in South Korea. For those who don't know, comfort women were those women who were forced into sexual slavery by the Imperial Japanese forces when Japan occupied the Korean Peninsula before and during World War II. And we've also seen court cases in South Korea against Japanese corporations seeking damages for Imperial Japan's forced labor of Koreans. Stephen, where do things stand today, and can a functioning working relationship between Tokyo and Seoul be put together?
Well, it's absolutely necessary if we're going to have a cohesive and integrated security framework to try and shape Chinese behavior over the coming decades. And I think South Korea and ASEAN is seen as the weak links in a broader network. South Korea, because its economy is so intertwined with the Chinese economy and subject to pressure by the Chinese when there's political disagreement. But of course, the Japanese and the South Koreans are divided on so many issues. But these issues, I think, are very focused issues. And you mentioned the comfort women issue, and you mentioned forced labor issues. These seem to have distracted both states from the broader strategic imperative of a strong bilateral security relationship and a strong trilateral security relationship with the United States. And here, I think strategic thinkers in Japan, at least, as well as the United States, are very astute, and they understand the importance of building a strong security partnership with South Korea. And I think they're trying to push these sensitive issues, the comfort women issue and labor issues, to the backdoor diplomacy forums where they can deal with these issues in a way that doesn't fundamentally disrupt the bilateral relations. But we're at this stage, we're having huge challenges. And just this week, the Seoul Central District Court, they announced a verdict against Japan on the comfort women issue as well, which really, it throws salt onto the wounds of the relationship, making it very difficult. And you also mentioned the 2015 Comfort Women Agreement. And I really, it's important to stress that, you know, the former Prime Minister Abe, is known as a conservative. I think he's known as a nationalist. And both of these are true, but I think they're not nationalists and conservatives in the sense that we think about this in the United States or Canada. But, you know, nobody else could have signed that agreement in Japan. It's like Nixon going to China, to give you a metaphor for understand. Nobody could have signed this agreement except for Prime Minister Abe because of his conservative credentials. And I don't think the South Koreans are going to find a counterpart in Japan that can renegotiate the agreement moving forward. So in this sense, you know, the tension is locked in until we see a change in government in Seoul and a change in how they approach bilateral relations with Japan.
So yesterday, here in the United States, President-elect Biden announced a plan for a $1.9 trillion package to help with coronavirus relief. And I wanted to know if you could share with us what Japan has been doing towards coronavirus relief, helping out Japanese businesses, even Japanese households and consumers.
So I think there's at least three things that they've been doing. Late April in 2020, they offered a subsidy, about $1,000 per resident of Japan. So if you're a foreign resident or a Japanese citizen, it didn't matter. So they offered about a $1,000 US dollar subsidy to each resident, and that was meant to boost consumption. Second, they provided subsidies to businesses that have agreed to close early. So I think it's up to about $600 or $700 US dollars a night if they close their business. And this is for, you know, pubs and restaurants and places people gather at night, because they've been requested to close at 8 o'clock. And I think that's that sounds really early, but for, you know, a culture like Japan where people go out and drink a lot and they eat a lot, and this is where they do a lot of their informal discussions about many things. Closing businesses early is a hit. So the government has provided a subsidy there. And they're also providing subsidies for businesses to enhance their telework presence so that they can work from home. But this is not an ideal situation for many aspects of the economy that actually have to be in the office to get their jobs done. For professors like me, people that are like yourself that can use technology to do their work, it's easy. But for many people, they just don't have a choice. They need to go into the office. So those are important areas. There's also tax breaks for people that buy houses during this period of time. So an extension of tax relief over a 12-year period of time. There's subsidies for people that have children during this period of time. So I think there's quite a bit of positive initiatives to try and ensure consumption continues, businesses can remain sustainable, and that you know, the ordinary lives of Japanese and residents of Japan are not so affected. But still, I don't think it's enough. I think that the government could probably do more. The question is, where does this money come from, right? And I think that's the same question that the Biden administration is going to face. You know, 1.9 trillion US dollars is a lot of money, and you already have debt. And the Japanese are already, I think, the first or second most indebted country, although that debt is towards domestic banks, not sovereign other countries. But still, I think the Japanese government is determined to subsidize and the lives of people. It's focused on maintaining as much social economic equality as possible, and to ensure that the dignity of most Japanese citizens, if not all, is maintained. And I think that is a very different approach, that the Japanese really feel uncomfortable when social inequality is very visible, and when the dignity of ordinary citizens is taken away from them. And we've seen that over decades, whether it's the Daiichi Fukushima nuclear incident, or other natural disasters. The Japanese government tends to be very equity-based in terms of the distribution of subsidies and goods, so that everybody comes away from the situation feeling that they've been treated the same as everybody else. And this connects to social stability and cohesiveness, because they don't turn to around the corner and say, that guy got more than me. Rather, they say, I got the same amount. And again, it preserves dignity and it preserves social stability.
I was reading earlier this week that there was a poll done by Kyodo News saying that over 80% of the Japanese public does not want to go forward with the already postponed Tokyo 2020 Olympics. Stephen, if you could bring out your crystal ball, what do you think is the likelihood that a decision will be made to cancel the games because of COVID?
So my sense here is that there's a political agenda, there's an economic agenda, and there's an election agenda here. So political agenda, I think that we should be very clear that, on July 23rd, 2021, when the opening ceremonies are supposed to take place in Tokyo, this is the same day that the Communist Party of China will be celebrating its 100th anniversary. And I think that Tokyo sees this as an opportunity to steal some of the stars, and to ensure that this is not something that is that for the world, that the world is focused on an open and a Tokyo Olympics that has been held by a democratic country that has overcome the coronavirus, or has dealt with the coronavirus. And it's meant to show that Japan is a leader, is stable, and that Japan is accepted globally as a status quo power. And I think this is symbolically incredibly important for Japan, but also many of its allies. And if the Olympics are held, the Chinese will be also focused on the Olympics. And I think this will, again, be problematic for this important celebration in China. So, political agenda. At the economic level, as I mentioned, there's been a whole bunch of money spent on the Olympics investment. And I think that from the economic standpoint, holding the Olympics will be an injection of capital, will be an injection of interest in Japan. And this will have, again, long-term consequences in terms of providing Japan a platform to demonstrate its technologies and demonstrate its society, and again, accrue more capital to bring in tourists and to bring in investment. So I think this is really important. And lastly, I mentioned the election. I think that if the Olympics is canceled, I think this will be a nail in the coffin of the Suga administration. He will have to take responsibility for its cancellation, and that means he will lose his position. We'll have a new prime minister in the fall. So at all three levels, I think it's really critical for the government to hold the Olympics. Now, the question is, what is the possibilities? I think that they'll do everything in their power to make sure it happens. So I'm not sure about the United States, but here in Japan, baseball games are still being held. Rugby games are still being held. They're being held with empty stadiums, or stadiums that have less populations, less fans. But the point is to test everything out so that if the Olympics are held, that they've shown that they can hold these events and minimize the spread of viruses. So what is the Japanese citizens' view of this? I think they're concerned about the virus being imported, like many countries. if we bring in athletes and we bring the media and we bring in tourists to watch this events, will this reintroduce the coronavirus into the Japanese population? And I think this is a current concern for the Japanese, but many countries. So it's always important to have a more granular look at these kinds of polls. But I think if we had a more granular look, and I think that we might find that there's greater support for holding the Olympics under certain conditions than others.
Mm. You have written before about how Japan is trying to balance its relationship with China and the United States. It must maintain its economic relationship with China, yet it's a politically sensitive time with the increasingly rising rivalry between the US and China. But also, as you mentioned, there are increased numbers of incursions into Japanese maritime waters by Chinese vessels, and as well as into Japanese airspace by Chinese aircraft. Amid this complicated landscape, how is Mr. Suga handling relations between China and the U.S.?
Well, I think that he inherited a relatively good position. And what I mean by that, when Prime Minister Abe came back into power in 2012, the relations were at the lowest point. This was after the nationalization of the Senkaku Islands, waves of anti-Japanese protests in some big cities in China. And what we saw over the 5 years is that diplomats behind doors found ways to put the relationship back into its traditional laneway. And that's, in Japanese, we say seike bunri, which basically means separation of politics and economics. So they worked very hard to try and decrease the tensions between the two states. But this was accelerated with the advent of the Trump administration. With the election of Mr. Trump, we saw an increasingly hard line against China. And China made the calculation, and China's a very rational actor, that they can't fight the United States and the Japanese and the South Koreans and the Filipinos and all the other states. So they made an active choice to start warming relations with Japan and South Korea and other states. And this is what I think really gives us some insight into how Japan thinks and how it manages its relationship with China, that if U.S.-China relations are tense, what we see is Japan-China relations move into a place where they have some more political space to secure their national interests. And we're in that particular position now. So the Suga administration would prefer that tensions in the United States and China remain, I don't want to say high, but they remain higher than normal, which means that China will be more focused on the United States and will feel the need to try and have a softer touch towards Japan and other partners within the region. How sustainable this will really depend on how confident or how insecure Beijing feels about its prospects with regards to the United States and its economy and regional security environment. And at this stage, we just don't know if China is overly confident or confident in its strengths, or if it's insecure in its strengths and that its external behavior is being informed by that confidence or those insecurity. I think most analysts would say that the confidence is actually insecurity, and the assertive behavior regionally and globally is meant to present the strongest image of China's political establishment, its leaders, Xi Jinping and others, so that they can maintain stability back home as downward pressures on the economy, as increased pressure on technology, and increased pushback against Chinese assertive behavior is happening by the US and other countries. Again, there's lots to unpackage there, but that's kind of in a nutshell, how I understand the situation.
Okay. I've also read what you've written about the Quad before, that 4-country coalition, if we can call it, designed to protect freedom of navigation in the Indo-Pacific, and which also serves as a counterweight to Chinese influence in the region. In your view, is the Quad in need of changes? Should it be expanded, or and also a follow-up question, what is Japan's motivation to involve itself with the Quad and its role? What role is it playing in the Quad?
So I was just part of a project led by Jagannath Panda at the Indian Defense Studies Institute in Delhi. And we did a special issue in the Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs on the Quad and the Quad Plus. And I think our general conclusions is the Quad moving forward will really depend, and inclusion of other states will really depend on the substance of its activities. So when we think about Japan and Australia, the United States and India, the four current members, they have different views about the function of the Quad. The United States has a very securitized view. Australia sits on the same page of the book as I think the United States on many aspects of the Quad. Japan sits on the fence because it doesn't want to instigate China too much, but it also understands the Quad is really critical to push back against China in its periphery and defend those sea lanes of communication. And India doesn't want to push on the Quad outside the Indian Ocean. And they're very uncomfortable in creating an institution that's directly targeted at China. From India's point of view, if there's a direct targeting of China by the Quad, that India will likely feel more pressure on the continental front with regards to Pakistan and the Himalayan plateau. So they don't want that. So the Quad moving forward, and I think Japan is probably going to move this way, it's going to focus more on development, infrastructure, connectivity, diversification of supply chains with some members. And with other members, it will probably focus more on a security alignment in the maritime domain. So we're going to see kind of a multi-level aspect of the Quad as it moves forward. The Quad also is a kind of formal agreement that these are trusted partners to work with if you're going to move forward on the areas of technology that I mentioned before, trade and economy, as well as security partnerships. So that means we're going to see more consolidation and joint research and joint training on the area of technology. In terms of economy, we're going to see more collaboration. And in the maritime domain, we're going to see more joint activities between those countries. Now, where do other countries fit in? We're seeing interest by the UK, by France, by Germany, by New Zealand, by Canada, where I'm from, all trying to carve out some kind of role for their countries to support the Quad in some capacity. But of course, they all have different capabilities, and they will lend those capabilities when they can. And they may not have an overt security role. They may just focus on, for example, maritime awareness activities, or they may focus on those supply chain diversification initiatives I mentioned. So again, it goes back to this idea of substance.
Sure.
What is of the Quad activities? And I think that that's undefined purposely so that they can have a participation by many countries.
Do you foresee Vietnam having some role going forward?
Well, Vietnam has adopted, they have a non-alliance policy. At the same time, they've adopted some interesting language in their recent national security document that says that they would like to cooperate with all countries. And they have an increasingly, I guess, positive stance towards the United States. And they've invested in relations with Japan, with Australia and India to get extra support for some of their bilateral disputes with China. And I think that Vietnam is going to find creative ways to push back in the South China Sea in a very targeted way. But I think that it's an illusion, or it would be unreasonable to expect that Vietnam takes a hard line approach to China. They share the same political system. They have shared political history, and they have a very strong economic relationship. And despite that, the average Vietnamese is quite anti-Chinese. the possibility for Vietnam splitting away from China very overtly, I think, is very, very slim at this stage in history.
Okay. A question about China's relationships with Australia and Canada. China is Australia's most important export market. It accounts for about 34% of its annual exports. And it is engaging in an economic coercion campaign to punish Australia for Australia calling for an independent investigation into the origins of COVID-19. And it has Beijing has called upon Chinese consumers to not buy Australian products, whether that's wine, cotton, coal, as a way to force Australia into submission for daring to challenge China. And it wants, I think, to make Australia a high-profile case for the rest of the world to see. Needless to say, this runs against all sorts of World Trade Organization rules and against the stipulations of China's free trade agreement with Australia. I think China has it out for Australia for different reasons also. I mean, Australia is a U.S. ally. Australia has criticized China's human rights abuses against the Uyghur Muslim population and against Beijing's crackdown in Hong Kong. And so, it's engaged in this economic coercion campaign against Australia. It's locked up a couple Australian citizens, including that prominent TV anchor, Chang Lei. And it's also, of course, taking retaliatory measures against Canada for locking up or arresting Wang Zhou, the daughter of the founder of Huawei, who serves as the CFO of Huawei. She was arrested in Canada about a year ago or so on conspiracy to commit fraud in order to circumvent U.S. sanctions against Iran. And one of China's retaliatory measures against Canada is locking up two Canadian citizens for over 2 years now. Michael Kovig, I think his name, and Michael Spavor. So in light of this dreary situation, what ought countries like Australia and Canada do to push back against Chinese coercion?
So what we see is, there's an expression in Chinese is to, you kill the chickens to scare the monkeys. And, the pressure on Canada and the pressure on Australia is meant to scare all the other countries that this could happen to you. We could have enormous amount of pressure on your economy that could change governments. It could cause, severe challenges to your state. So this economic coercion is a track record of behavior by the Chinese. And, we should be frank, though, it's not just the Chinese doing this. The United States under the Trump administration did economic coercion against the Japanese and the Koreans and the Canadians to shape their trade behavior. So it's not just a Chinese behavior, but I think the Chinese have been much more explicit. And I think the situation for, as you mentioned, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor and others is very serious. To push back, it depends. I think that, I've advocated in some of my writing for, a three musketeer approach, right? One for all and all for one, in that countries do come together and they form some kind of pact that they basically say that if you're going to engage in these activities, that we will collectively sanction you. And I think that, there's other ways to push back, collectively sanction, but perhaps open up their markets temporarily so that, let's say, the Australians that are not getting their wine bought by Chinese or their barley or their meat, that other countries will suck up that temporarily until the situation changes. Now, there's many challenges behind this kind of approach, but there's growing calls for some kind of pact of like-minded countries that they will agree to engage in these kinds of activities. Now, I think there's other pressure points that we could have. One is, a temporary ban on Communist Party members traveling to our countries until these practices change. Temporary ban on Chinese students coming to our countries. There's ways to pressure the state, the Chinese, in a way that affects the legitimacy of their political leaders. And I think that some kind of pact, and our Canadian foreign minister has advocated this in the case of these kinds of hostage diplomacy actions that the Chinese have engaged in. But I think that we can develop some sophisticated multilateral approaches to applying not only economic pressure on China, but I think importantly, reputational pressure on China. Others opportunities is withdrawing from Belt Road Initiative activities, thinking about withdrawing from the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. These are all important institutions for the Xi Jinping and the Communist Party. And if we withdraw, it's a reputational hit that I think stains their leadership, and it stains these Chinese global initiatives. And we need to think creatively how we can do that.
China has locked up an estimated 1.5 million to 2 million of its Muslim Uyghur population. And it's also engaged in a systematic effort to control the religion of Christianity on Chinese soil, tearing down crosses from hundreds of churches throughout the country, and editing the Bible, trying to make Christianity have Chinese characteristics according to the Chinese Communist Party's interpretation and so forth. Some have called for, given its human rights abuses against the Uyghurs, against Christians, against the crackdown in Hong Kong, some have called for China's Winter Olympic Games in 2022 to be canceled. What have you heard about those calls, and what do you think the likelihood of that is?
First, I think that there is an incredible amount of well-documented research about the re-education camps for the Uyghur people. We should be clear, it's not just the Uyghur people. There's other ethnic Muslims throughout Western China that have been put into these institutions. The Christians, as you mentioned, have suffered different kinds of pressure. These are very serious actions. And some of my colleagues call it cultural genocide. They call it new forms of colonialism. It's very, very serious. Now, can we translate the global pushback against China into boycotting the Winter Olympics? I think that that's a possibility. I think we need to choose the battles that we do have with China very, very carefully. Boycotting the Olympics would definitely be a reputational hit for the Communist Party, but it may backfire on us or countries that do potentially boycott the Olympics. In terms of pushing the ordinary Chinese much more into the camp of the CCP. So I think that we need to think about these carefully. What we want to do is to show the strengths of an open society, the strengths of democratic systems, the strengths of rule of law, transparent legal systems. And that I think if we do something that really has not only a reputational hit for the Communist Party, but that will affect ordinary Chinese, that I think we need to be very careful about this. But this doesn't take away the severe and really the severe aspect of the human rights violations of the Uyghur people, the growing, I think, human rights violations in Hong Kong and other aspects of China. The question is, how do we deal with this? And I think that we need to think very carefully because we could lock in sentiment that could create a decades-long conflict and mistrust. And that's not a way to build a positive relationship. And ultimately, I think the United States and other countries in the region, they want to have a relationship with China, and they want to have a better relationship with China. The question is how to do that.
Good. as a follow-up to that, you know, if President-elect Biden were to ask you, um, what are some areas in which Washington and Tokyo could work with Beijing? What are some common policy areas of collaboration where we could, work together and maybe solve problems for not only our respective countries but the world? What would you say to him?
Well, I think that, and this is going to be hard for the Biden administration because the Trump administration is really locked in a lot of the rivalry into the relationship with some of his most recent policies. But right away, I think the first one is on COVID-19, distributing vaccines and therapeutics to emerging. You know, I was watching the news this morning. There's been 11 million or 12 million vaccinations in the United States since the vaccination started. You know, African countries, they're not going to have vaccinations maybe for years. They're going to be locked into a COVID world for years. Here, I think the Biden administration should work with Tokyo and perhaps Beijing to provide a vaccination system for emerging states. This is a win-win. It's really important to help emerging states because they're the places where terrorism, extremism, poverty, and other issues will emerge if we don't help stabilize their societies. A second area I think is really important is going to be climate change and dealing with climate change globally. And here there seems to be a little resistance to holding a global climate conference and committing to global climate strategies. The Chinese and Japanese have already said that they're going to have zero emissions by 2050 and 2060, respectively. Here, I think commitment by the United States and China and Japan collectively could garner some what I call crosswalks to build discussions on the more difficult issues. Another area is North Korea. How can we move North Korea towards a more positive direction, towards denuclearization? And here, I think that security guarantees by China on North Korea in return for some kind of denuclearization or transparency, commitments by the United States to decrease or to reciprocate their position on the peninsula if they see movement by North Korea. And Japan can move forward by perhaps funding some of the reconstruction of North Korea and providing some infrastructure and connectivity aid along with China. So there's creative ways to move forward in terms of cooperation between the three capitals.
A question about Shinzo Abe. I saw that you came out with a fascinating piece in the Melbourne Asian Review about Shinzo Abe and his legacy. For those of us in the audience who aren't familiar, who was Shinzo Abe? Why was he a consequential leader of Japan?
Well, Shinzo Abe is, he had to step down from power in August 2020 because of intestinal challenges. But he was a leader for almost 8 years of Japan. And this is significant because Japan has had, since the 1990s, really, I think more than 20 or 25 prime ministers. I can't remember anymore. There's just been so many. So he provided 8 years of strategy, of thinking about the domestic economy, about thinking about women's roles in the economy, thinking about how to change the Japanese society. He also had a very significant role internationally in terms of signing important agreements, such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, signing something called the Japan-EU Economic Partnership Agreement, signing the Japan-EU Asian Infrastructure Connectivity Agreement. These are agreements that really focus on multilateralism, championing multilateralism, working with other countries. And when you work with other countries, you develop shared norms, shared rules, and trust. And this decreases the chance for conflict. And I think that's been really critical. That's one of his legacies. But Prime Minister Abe also comes from a tradition of politics that's quite conservative, some nationalist agendas. So he's known to visit Yasukuni Shrine, which is the home where many Class A war criminals were interned in the 1970s. And it's controversial because, of course, these war criminals committed many atrocities, both on the Korean Peninsula, also in China. So he's seen as a revisionist in many ways. And he's seen as somebody that is less apologetic for Japan's position and its stance during the imperial period. And this creates challenges in terms of bilateral relations with South Korea and North Korea, but also China. But that being said, I think his private views differ from his role in government, in that he was a much more pragmatic leader, that he understood the importance of being pragmatic at the domestic and international level to get things done. And this is what I think makes him consequential, that he could put his private views away to warm relations with China, to sign that Comfort Women Agreement to try and move the bilateral relations in a different direction, to work with leaders like Mr. Trump, which wasn't their first choice. And in that sense, I think Prime Minister Abe is consequential, but he's also been lucky. You know, his golf club gambit with President Trump worked, and that was very lucky. He was lucky that the policies of the Trump administration didn't put Japan in an awkward place, or cause Japan to lose the lives of Japanese citizens, or Japanese citizens being kidnapped by the Chinese government, like the Canadians had with Michael Korvik and Michael Spavoro. He's also divisive, and this should be very clear. Prime Minister Abe is very divisive domestically, both for, I think, real reasons as well as fabricated reasons. Again, he's seen as an art conservative and a hardcore nationalist, and somebody that wants to militarize the state by some, those that are wedded to the Article 9 of the Constitution and wedded to pacifism. And others see him as very pragmatic and someone that has brought enormous change to Japan. In reality, I think all those aspects are in part true. But if I was to make an assessment, I think that, again, he has been consequential. He's been lucky. And some of his policies have been divisive because I think they've stepped on the toes of stakeholders that are very vested in their particular values and the current economic and social system, which really is not well situated to deal with the demographic challenges that Japan has moving forward, debt, as well as the security challenges in the region.
Do you have 5 more minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. You're a prolific writer. A few questions that I like to ask of authors, if I may. Stephen, where do you write when you typically write?
Oh, that's a good question. I write in Starbucks. I write in the gym. I write at home. I write everywhere. But I think I write in a very concentrated way. And I think a lot. I listen to a lot of smart people. I love podcasts, and I take my inspiration from many, many, many people. And I think that, you should always be actively trying to learn many things. I also think that you should read widely. So I may not agree with all the very conservative views or the very liberal views, but I should be informed by all those views. And in that sense, that I try to read as widely as possible about things like Mr. Trump or Mr. Abe or the Chinese government, to get a better sense of the continuum of ideas about different topics.
What time of the day or what time of the night do you write?
I write in the morning. I'm a morning person, and the reason is I can avoid, most meetings aren't scheduled first thing in the morning. So it's a time where it's quiet and focused. I also write, I guess, quite intensively between 4 and 7 at night.
Okay.
And again, this is when there's no meetings.
Right.
Um, and I tend to write where there's no Wi-Fi.
Ah,
So I'm not,
okay. That's smart.
yeah. So on planes, because well, until COVID-19 happened, I would travel overseas twice a month. So I'd be on the plane a lot. Um, and I would write on the plane, very concentrated. And, I always write a sentence and I put reference at the bottom because I couldn't remember the reference right away. And then I get all the text down. And when I land, I have Wi-Fi. I can go find the references and input the references. So it's about productivity and how to keep the ball rolling rather than stopping and finding the reference. And I think that's critical to being productive.
When you write, do you have background music on or do you need silence?
I'm a big fan of Bach and the cello. So I listen to a lot of Bach when I'm writing, but I also have found there's some really good uh, uh, links on YouTube to help you concentrate, whether it's a heartbeat or some kind of concentration music. I find them both useful, but I don't listen to music that has words or singing.
Okay. Now, when you write, do you snack or do you drink anything?
Oh, that's a good question. I sip tea, yeah, Japanese tea or lemon tea. I sometimes have a coffee. I'm a bit of a cookie monster, so I do like chocolate chip cookies and things like this. But yeah, I don't snack too much, but I just sip and try and focus on my writing because again, I focus on concentrated writing and not sitting down writing for 8 or 10 hours straight.
Okay, so in case any of our students are watching, for aspiring writers, do you have any general words of advice?
Aspiring writers. So I'm a real believer in getting all your creative writing done before 11 o'clock in the morning, because after that, don't procrastinate, because if you procrastinate, you won't get it done.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a real believer in podcasts and listening to smart podcasts. So I listen to Sub China. I listen to a podcast from the Council of Foreign Relations. I have some really good podcasts, and I listen to many languages: Japanese, Chinese, English. So podcasts are a great way to upskill, and I think you always need to upskill. I also believe that at least once a day you should go to a library and read about music and read about history and read about literature and read things that aren't your specialty. And why I say that is that it pushes you to start to think about things and create links between things. And I think that's really, really critical to become somebody that can consume lots of different kinds of information and get inspiration from many different areas. And lastly, I ask questions. I won't say lastly, I ask questions, and I get my friends to read my work. What do you think? Give me criticism. And that includes my graduate students. So what do you think? Is this easy for you to understand? So I really think that the more feedback we can get, the more input we can be more productive and more creative. And I think it'd be more fulfilled in what we write and what we produce.
Terrific words of advice. Last question. This COVID, we're at some point going to get our arms around it, and we will begin traveling again. And without question, people will begin returning to Japan, tourists and so forth. Can you recommend a restaurant or two in Tokyo that you would suggest for people to visit? Or if not, maybe a Japanese dish or two for visitors to Japan to try when they come over after this is over?
So places to visit. I spent the summer in Nagano. So it's a prefecture in central Japan, and from there we were able to travel all through western and central Japan, and the countryside has so much to offer. So if you're interested in mummies, not the mom and dad kind of mummies, but Egyptian kind of mummies, there's a temple in Yamagata that has a Japanese mummy, and the mummy is it's a monk and monks that have mummified themselves through some kind of aesthetic training, which I found fascinating. And this is the kind of thing that you'll find if you go and explore in the countryside. In terms of food, Japan is all about raw foods and bringing out the flavor of the natural flavors of food. So we visited a seafood market in just north of Niigata City called Nao. And we had fresh crab and fresh sea urchin. And they were spectacular. So those are great tastes if you like seafood. If you are not a seafood fan, there's something called okonomiyaki, which is Japanese pancake or Japanese pizza, but they put you pork in it or seafood or whatever you like, and it's a very savory, flavorful cooked dish. That's really, really wonderful. And I think everybody that visits Japan should visit a Japanese ryokan, which is a Japanese inn, and try their kaiseki food. It's just it's an amazing visual display, and the tastes are wonderful, and the service is just incredible.
Well, Professor Nagy, I could ask you so many more questions, but I want to be respectful of your time. I can't thank you enough. This has been a real treat. Thank you for joining us. Please keep healthy, and much continued success to you.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to talk to you, Ted, and I look forward to more discussions with you. But you as well, keep healthy, be positive, and let's make sure 2021 is a much better year than 2020.
Hear, hear. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.